Perfect. Okay. So thanks so much for making time for this session again. I know it's at the end of a long conference and everybody is tired, so I'll try to make it worthwhile your time. My name is Ankush Kapoor. I am EVP for Solutions with Cybersolve. And what we're going to try to talk today about is taking a unified, IGA, PAM, and access management approach, and how do we orchestrate all of this together to maximize IAM adoption. And frankly, as we were typing this out, we realized that's a mouthful of a title. Sounded like a research paper, and I have asthma, so I have to be careful with that one. So let's break it down a bit, right? Let's try to talk about what we're really going to focus on. So our focus is going to be how do you maximize IAM adoption, and irrespective of the product you go with, irrespective of the problem space that you're in, whether it's IGA, whether it's PAM, whether it is access management, your problem space always remains adoption. Your product selection was the easier part, always, when you look back at it, right? Understanding those features and the applicability was the easier part. Onboarding applications, onboarding assets is really the difficult part. And in that ROI equation of how much do you spend or invest and how much you get return on, the spend is very deterministic. Every time it's based on a number of users, a number of assets, and very quickly early in the program you start incurring that cost, because very quickly in, say, an IGA or an access management solution, you'll onboard all your users from your HR system or elsewhere, and now you're paying. But your return is completely based on the footprint of the solution, the number of applications that you onboarded and what you're doing with the solution for those applications, right? So we really focus on that. Orchestration and unified we'll get to in a bit. So the first problem is, when should you consider unifying? And we'll break it down in terms of, when you're saying unify, are we thinking unifying the parts of the IGA program with parts of the PAM program with part of the access management program? Because you're still going to the same application teams, sometimes to the same infrastructure teams. You just have a different perspective, a different line of questioning, and sometimes a different bunch of compliances to meet. But the ask is not very dissimilar. So the key thing is, when should you consider this? And let's start with extreme cases, and we find that the answer, like most things, is somewhere in the middle. In an utopian world, you want to start right at the outset. Why not? We'll ask all the questions in one go. We don't want to waste application teams' time. We'll talk about IGA, we'll talk about PAM as well. And while we are at it, IGA has so many more questions. PAM as access management is relatively straightforward. How do you do authentication? How do you do authorization? Do you have control on your source code? Can we change the authentication headers, SAML, OIDC, all of that, right? Seems really tempting. And in an ideal world, you'll get all of that information and you'll get going to the races and you get everything integrated. Fortunately for services providers like me, and unfortunately for a lot of us, we are not in an ideal world, right? So what happens is, if you try to do all of that too early in the program, in your attempt to do too much, you actually slow your program down. Your goals were wonderful, your intentions were the best, but you actually slowed down because you try to bite a lot together, right? At the other extreme is doing this how it's normally done. The IGA track has its own track, own set of questions, sometimes its own set of applications that are prioritized. It's completely different from what SSO and access management is trying to do. And PAM is on a completely different trip. In fact, PAM is a different case also because you're not just thinking in terms of applications. Now you're thinking in terms of assets, assets and accounts, service accounts, and so on and so forth. So it's really a very, very different ballgame there. So when should you consider unifying? And our rule of the thumb is, first let your program taste initial success. If you try to do a lot of it upfront, you're increasing chances of failure because you're trying to boil the ocean. The intentions are the best, but as stakeholders, you may not get credit for attempting that. What will you get credit for? You'll get credit for having done flat file integrations with IGA, which is not even doing lifecycle management, but at least now you know who has access to what. And business sees benefits and they're willing to invest. They're willing to invest money, they're willing to invest time. Application teams will be willing to engage more because they now realize that there are tasks that they were doing which were a real pain for them that now security is helping them out and taking over. So it's extremely important again to taste success initially, and then get to that next stage, right? Application integration. How do you find balance, right? How do you find, and a lot of this discussion is actually about finding that balance, right? So how do you find a balance between the various tracks that you're going to go over and all the features that you want to implement versus what was, and what was initially promised to you versus what your business really needs as of today. I'll come back to the same example. If the need of the hour is access certification, it may be tempting to go after access lifecycle management at the same time, right? But figuring out automated access lifecycle management is very different. It's a very different problem statement from figuring out access certification. In access certification, the only question you need an answer to, this user has this access, should they continue to have this access? In some form, you don't care why they got it in the first place. You just want to know, should they still have it? But when you're trying to automate the life cycle, there's another bunch of questions that you need to consider. Who should request it? Who should approve it? What happens when they are on leave? For how long can that request exist? What happens when it times out? So on and so forth, right? And what all of this results in, whether it's IGA, whether it's PAM, whether it's access management, is delay. And really, that's what we're really here to, to conserve time, because time is the only non-renewable resource that all of us have with us, right? There's no capturing that back, and as I'm sure all of you have heard, time is money, right? So, so the approach that we take, and I'll cover this from various aspects, but in many things that we do in IAM, we don't take a all or nothing approach. An all or nothing approach is a somewhat dangerous, idealistic approach in IAM. It prevents you from achieving what you can in the moment and in the near future. And again, tasting that success is really important. So we look at how do you set up a framework when you want to unify these things at the right time, where you have thought of stakeholders, you've thought of what sort of tech coverage you're looking at, your requirements, data types, and of course, once you have all of that, how do you go downstream from there? So first thing, talk about stakeholders. Who are your stakeholders? And sometimes the answer is not very clear. The program may be owned by security. Your stakeholder may be the application community. If your prioritization is efficiency, sometimes security may own the controls, but may have no leverage with the application teams. If it's a SIAM program, it may be a digital transformation program. They may not even see the access management part of it as a security thing. It's business functionality. Users need to authenticate at scale, as simple as that, right? So knowing who your stakeholders are becomes really important. Where are you going to support, going to get support next? That's the next part. And we're talking about this map overall because unlike a lot of other security initiatives, identity is cross-functional, right? So we wish sometimes that this could operate in isolation and we could just go heads down, work for weeks at end, and when we come out, we've got a beautiful system running in production. But IAM does not fly like that. HR never anticipated that you're going to use their data downstream for automation. So when the IAM team goes back to HR and says, your data is dirty, HR says, then who are you to tell me that, right? So you have to factor all of that in when you're thinking about the stakeholders in your environment, right? Let's talk about the coverage that you're looking at. What is the technology coverage, first of all, right? You're looking at IGA, you're trying to get more success from there. You're trying to, also run a PAM project concurrently. Do you want to try and unify those things? What about access management? And an aspect that is often missed out on and is increasingly in the news is incident management. And yes, I did not call it ITDR because unfortunately I don't understand that term very well. What I do understand is when there is an attack, and invariably, no matter what the root cause is, what is often pinpointed is somebody got access that they should not have. That is how it is framed to the IAM team. I have seen scenarios where there was a vulnerability in an application that resulted in a privilege escalation, which happens in Linux and so many other languages. But because it's phrased like that, it suddenly becomes a PAM problem. It's as if the PAM controls failed. So, looking at which of these you want to unify is really important. What features you're looking at there is then also important. Like, and again, go to that initial example. You want to do just access management. You want to do just access certification. You want to also simplify the JML process? Do you want to manage the entire life cycle of the user? Do you want to do entitlement management as well? Do you want to do role mining while you're at it? Do you want to do access certification of not only the users, but also the role composition? Which roles should have which entitlements? And while we are at it, should we also spend some time and put in some nice English descriptions on all our roles and entitlements so that auditors don't come back and say that your users don't know what they're requesting and your managers don't know what they're approving? So you see, it suddenly becomes so tempting as perfectionists. If you want to do a good job, I'll do all of it. So, working with, we have to manage not only our management but ourselves to say, I know that's the gold standard, I will get there, but today I'll do this and business will benefit, right? It becomes extremely important. Last, application and asset coverage, asset specifically for PAM, but application for the other two. And clearly, we've had so many conversations with customers, say, how many applications do you have? And there's no specific answer. And I don't blame them, because industry hasn't evolved in that form, right? So we get a list of 3,000 things, and sometimes an Excel sheet is also labeled as an application. That happens, right? So if that list is not clear, imagine figuring out prioritization, right? And essentially, you want to keep two things in mind. One is what is the primary driver of all of that, which could be compliance, and we say, SOX applications, these 100 applications, let's go after them. It's a no-brainer. But in the back of your mind, you'll also want to keep, how can I non-linearly engage with all our other application teams? And I've had so many instances implementing on projects where after 13 months of doing a project, I came across an application owner who said, yes, I've got 20 applications. I understood what you did on one of my applications. I loved it. Here are my remaining applications. I architected them similarly. Here's the data. Get this off my back. And I'm wondering, what would it have taken me to discover this person at the outset of the project, right? Because when you slice and dice it, you'll think, you want the easy apps up front. Why? Yeah, it's a low-hanging fruit. You deliver results quickly. But you also want to start on the difficult apps early enough. Why? Because it's going to take them longer. They're difficult. They're more complex. They'll take more back and forth. You don't want to start them at the end of 12 months. So somewhere in that prioritization, you want to make it non-linear, right? Let's talk about requirements. We spoke a bit about all the features and all the ways where they can come in. But let's talk about how do you define it, how do you gather it, how do you capture that information, right? Review it, and most importantly, how do you manage scope? How do you manage scope internally? How do you manage scope with IT GRC if they are your partners in this? How do you manage scope with your vendor if you engage a vendor? Because the last thing that you want is a piece of paper slowing down your program, right? So that's it. And then we'll talk about data types. And data types really manifest themselves in various forms. Data types could be metadata such as application metadata, user metadata, entitlement metadata, and of course, what actors are going to be in the system. So from here, now it's more predictable, because now you're going to talk about how you want to do integration development for all of the integration points that you've actually identified. There could be some unification there, but normally it's very separate work streams, because from that point onwards, the technology has started diverging significantly. But it's worth considering what sort of automation investments you can make, especially in testing, so that every time your IAM program becomes more complex, every time you add features, you don't waste time testing the same features over and over again, afraid that something may have broken, right? Last is obviously release planning, organization change management, exceptionally important. Sometimes the IAM program comes in, and then people realize that the organization change management needs to gear up. Then there's training, managing user transition, and so on. And sometimes this also has to do with how many changes do you want to introduce. Do you want to introduce the SSO and the request part together, or should that be a separate change in your environment? So what we did was we took a stab at this problem in a couple of ways, right? And we set up something called Identity Express. And this is just one way to do it. There are many ways to skin this. This is just a culmination of our experience over the years. What we did was create a platform where we democratized application onboarding. So we created a platform where application teams can interact with the platform, provide the requirements, go through a decision tree. Their management and the IAM leadership can see status of where they are on the integration status of every application. especially with requirements gathering. And why do I say requirements gathering, right? Because in college, I wasn't that smart. My professors kept telling me requirement gathering is the most important part of the SDLC. And I was so excited about development that I really didn't realize that. But in industry, we realized this. It takes me 2 days, sometimes less than that, to build a custom connector in SailPoint. But it can take up to a month to figure out requirements, right? So with this sort of a platform where we can integrate with SailPoint, where we can integrate with Savient, with Okta and Ping, the requirements can be captured from the application owner in one go if that's what your unification goal is. The requirements can be gathered for a particular piece, but you can capture compliance and other stuff as well if that is your unification course, right? What it does is it orchestrates that interaction with the application team and other stakeholders to ensure that we are able to collect the information that we want, in some cases automatically then write code to onboard an application. And trust me, that is again the easier part. The requirement gathering has always been the more difficult part. Or we work with a bunch of engineers who then take those requirements and then take them to reality. So what I'll do is since I have a history of taking risks like this, I'll do something live, right? And see if it'll work. So I'm logging in as an application owner. You can see that as an application owner, I know what sort of work me or my team have done in terms of onboarding applications over time. In which space do I have a progress? If I'm onboarding application on various tracks, I could filter by what sort of compliance directives are really driving these requirements. And more interestingly, I can actually provide requirements right here, like looking at a bunch of applications that are assigned to me, provide the requirements right here, and then actually onboard it to a particular endpoint. And I've got a couple of videos that I can very quickly skim through, just to be able to show that. So here's an application owner who comes here, provides certain information for an application. This is a decision tree, and this selects a JDBC. Next line of question is going to be for a JDBC-based application. This is going to be a custom application. The connector, there's no native connector that exists for any custom schema that you have, right? So you need to build a custom connectors, and the system will gather typical information, host name, port, and all of that, but also talk about what do you want to do with that information. How do you create accounts? How do you delete accounts? How do you add an entitlement, remove an entitlement? Typically, those be JDBC queries and so on. So we take all of that information. We give them the opportunity to do entitlement mapping, metadata mapping, and so on and so forth. And not only that, allow them to add English descriptions. Again, like I said, you can boil the ocean as much as you want to. You can eliminate these things in round one, keep them for round two. So in thinking in terms of sprint and backlog really, really helps. And once all of that information is available, the entitlements are also inserted. You do a role mapping, which is very useful because when users are requesting, they don't want to request 5 entitlements to do something. They'd rather request a role that allows them to do that. And once all of that is done, they come in here and they say onboard the application. Of course, do not do this in production, but in a non-production environment, it works beautifully, right? And what we're attempting to show is that not only the requirement gathering part is streamlined, we have also managed to streamline the actual application onboarding into something like SailPoint IDN, SailPoint IAQ, Savient, Ping, Okta. And we've got some use cases for CyberArk as well, right? While we are doing all of this, what we also do is we generate documentation for it, and documentation is critical from from an audit perspective. You need an artifact that you want to bounce around on email, among colleagues, get feedback, get sign off, use DocuSign or what have you. All of that information is available and it timestamps. So you can go back in time and say, on so and so date, these are the requirements that were provided, and this is why the system functioned the way it did. Because in IAM systems, that question often happens. The system did something. Is it a feature or a bug? People lost access. Is this a feature or a bug? And more oftentimes it's actually a feature. You intentionally did something, but you forgot about that requirement. In this case, we come into SailPoint. We see that the application has been set up. The roles have been set up. The entitlements have been set up. The English descriptions are there. You see which entitlements are marked as privileged. access aggregation, account aggregation has run. So the users in the application are associated with what we have, in SailPoint. And practically speaking, you are in business, right? And if a human wants to tweak it from that standpoint, they can. But this engagement model allows you to engage thousands of application owners concurrently, and you focus on the ones that you wanted to work with, but all those people who wanted to work with you and get this thing off the back, you now have data coming in from them. Sometimes a preliminary questionnaire that we do is also very useful. Maybe sometimes we just want to figure out who has Active Directory group-based applications, who has in-house based, homegrown JDBC-based applications, and then everything else, maybe it's a COTS application, something else. Just figuring that out really, really helps at times. What we've also done is, and I'll try to launch another video here is, so what you saw was a decision tree, right? This is, we started using a large language model now, and we've flipped the coin on this. So usually when you go online, you look at ChatGPT, what do? You ask the question, and the large language model responds to you. In this case, what we've done is, the model asks the questions, and the human responds. And we are doing this for requirement gathering. At this point, it is in a text-based format. Next steps are to make it voice-based. In our prototypes, we've also been able to ingest documents. So if the application owner says, I've got this document from the help desk, and it explains how they add users currently in our system, they can give us that document, and this will assimilate it. And the great part about this is there is guidance on this. It doesn't go off the rails. Good example is I was running an Okta test for requirement gathering, and it asked me, what do you want to do when user authentication fails? And just for kicks, I said, call 911 and send the cops to the user's house and have him arrested, because of course there was an authentication failure, right? And that was Llama 3 that I was doing this with, and the language model comes back and says, while it's good to be security conscious, that's not an appropriate response. So what would you like to do? Right? And we have to factor in these safeguards, because when the humans are interacting with a bot, these responses will come in, right? The best part is it keeps it on course. If the user is busy, it can come back to it later. The user says, I don't want to answer this right now. It'll come back to it later. It can shell that. But after you can correct the responses. And at the end of all of this, what it does is, I'll just scroll it ahead. So at the end of all of this, what it'll do is it'll take all of those inputs. It'll again create a document for you, right? So you have a starting point. You're not starting from scratch. And you can do this at scale. So that traditional problem of we don't know what our applications are about and all of that starts getting reduced. Yes, we still engage with stakeholders and others to make sure that adoption is driven from the top, but all of this goes a long way in reducing friction, and that's extremely important, because our application owners' experience with the real world, with SaaS applications, Facebook, and everything else, is now all about reduced friction. And that's what we as IAM team managers want to do, to be able to unify our programs and make them successful. So thank you so much. I'll be happy to take questions. Sure, sir.
I was interested in what you would do for people who've gotten, they have a workaround to the IGA where they're doing flat file, and those solutions work but are not auditable and whatnot. So for those solutions, do you push policy to be able to embrace the change that you would want for them to be able to centralize that IGA, make it auditable and all that? Or
sure. So I'll try to paraphrase your question for everybody's benefit, and if I didn't get it, please let me know. So the question is that, say somebody has a solution where they are ingesting flat files for access certification purposes, but they want to increase adoption. Would it be a recommendation to take policies and so on as one of the tools to help the organization embrace this and then go to maybe a more mature solution? Is that
right? Yeah, basically you have an IGA, but they've taken a workaround to it.
Sure.
They take a flat file from the source.
Understood. So they're taking a flat file from the source. So first of all, flat file from the source is a really good start, because at the outset you get to know who has access to what, right? That's the first thing. But, okay. They're telling us time's up, so I'll keep this short. My main recommendation always is the problem has to be experienced by the application teams before the IAM team comes with the solution. Otherwise, when the IAM team comes to the application team, the IAM team is the problem. So if the application teams understand that access has to be certified one way or another, if you're not using SailPoint, fine, you use Excel sheets, you export it, you reach out to the users, you do this, and maybe some people from some team will help you do it, but this is on you. Then that's a pain. And then and that's driven by policy, right? And then when security comes in and says, we've got a solution, we can automate all of this for you, we can take this off your back. Moreover, once I take it off your back, I become responsible for it. You're not on the hook for it anymore. Everybody loves it. So I think using policy smartly like that is really important. And sometimes IAM programs don't work out well because they don't find support in policy, right? So, and that's when you talk about, okay, who's got a bigger stick and so on. So excellent question, thank you.